YouTube community, what's your spin, fans, random people on the internet? My name is Giggens, and I'm joined here today by Trevor from the Burkharts. Hey man, how you doing?
I'm good as I can be. How are you doing, Giggens?
Doing all right, man. Doing all right. I'm stoked to have you on today because for those of you watching at home, this is the first episode of my new series, What's Your Spin, where I ask music people what's their take on a band that they love that they think more people should either be more aware of or certain aspects of the band that they really dig that people think are or maybe they've overlooked. So, with this episode, what's the band you want to talk about, Trevor from the Burkharts?
I'm picking a band, that more people should hear about. Not many people know about them. Relatively unknown band called the Beatles. Uh,
The
yeah.
Beatles.
They have two indie films they put out, three indie films they put out, um, four indie films they put out. So that they're multifaceted, multimedia geniuses. You may have heard a couple of their songs. I'm here to spread the wealth, spread the knowledge.
I mean, one of those movies was like an art house movie. It was in black and white. Like how cool of them to do
This is a
that.
French film.
It was a French film. So, Trevor from the Burkharts, what's your spin on the Beatles?
My spin on the Beatles. I mean, I think I'm also a very big Beach Boys fan. I think a lot of people have gotten into my music because of like being mutual fans of the Beach Boys, like I am. But I gotta say, I do think overall, I think the Beatles are the greatest to do it. Just consistency. They call it quits at the right time. Um, I think the highs they reached were like just the highest anyone's ever reached, and I think a lot of people kind of overlook the highs they reached because of how high they were. I think it's like the Seinfeld effect. I think it's called. Well, they came before Seinfeld, but I think a lot of people, people watch Seinfeld for the first time in the modern age, and they're like, "Whoa, what's so special about this?" And it's like, they were the first to do it, or they popularized it. So I think the Beatles have a lot of that going on, where like people are like Sergeant Pepper's. Who cares about that? Like, oh, they have an orchestra, and it's like, oh,
Yeah.
they have backwards tapes and Revolver, like.
Yeah.
But it's like I think and they just revolutionized so much, and they sounded very, very catchy and commercial while doing it. It's just kind of not much needs to be more, more needs to be said.
So do you think that they're overlooked or they're taken for granted or advantage of because of how much music has changed since they were innovators? Whereas you're so far removed from what they did when they were new that music has changed so much and things that they did that were crazy and new and cool are these days as part of how you make a song, or where do you come from on that angle?
Yeah, I just think so many songwriting and production like standards of today are like just things that kind of revolutionize. Like the obvious ones that people point out are like the automatic double tracking is used
Mm.
so often now, and that was just because like John Lennon didn't want to double track vocals anymore.
Yeah.
Or there's just like some of the chords they'd go to. Obviously, they didn't invent really much, but a lot of the stuff they did like just kind of they made a lot of the innovations that they embraced whatever like mainstream like there's like the interview in I think 63 or 4 they're talking about it won't be long and the verse goes from E to C major
Mm.
and the interviewer was like oh that's a I don't really know the musical term here but like and then I think John makes the joke of like oh I guess we'll have to see a doctor about that and so like there's just so many weird things that even at the time people acknowledged were really weird that they were able to take and make like pop hits out of. So I guess like going back to your question, yeah, I think they're overlooked in the sense that like the Beatles are so massive and they've been around so long and you hear them everywhere that everybody's like like you said they almost take it for granted.
Yeah, I mean, you're in your 20s, right?
Yeah,
So for your generation in your 20s, do you feel like it's when I look online, when I look at TikTok, there's a huge group of people that I feel are obsessed with the 60s. They dress like the 60s. They make their room look like it's the 60s. They love the Beatles and the Beach Boys and all those groups. But there's also a huge part that doesn't give a flying monkeys about anything to do with that era of music. So Do you find in your 20s that you're kind of at a split with who your peer group is in terms of what you think is cool, or where do the Beatles land for you in terms of like your contemporaries in your age group?
I think that's almost like the reason I kind of choose the Beatles almost as like the greatest of all time, because I think they almost transcend that a little bit. Where whereas like bands like I love the Beach Boys, like they're Beatles and Beach Boys are 1A 1B, but I feel like you have to be a little more like in the weeds to like really appreciate the Beach Boys and like the Monkees and like the other acts from the '60s that didn't really you know, uh, they didn't really like kind of break that. Like when you think of the Beach Boys, you think of a '60s band, or you think of the Monkees, you think of a '60s band. But I think the Beatles are kind of just timeless because, and I think a part of that is because most of the members had like solo careers that went on. Well, I guess they all had solo careers, but Paul with Wings and then John's stuff, and George had like All Things Fast. Like there's just some huge records that they kept putting out up until like the '80s, and so I think they've all remained culture relevant throughout time, and I
Yeah.
think like they almost transcend that whole like '60s culture thing. But to your point is like I do agree that like the people that really get into the really into the Beatles are kind of like those '60s enjoyers. Those people that are really fanatics about the '60s. So I think like there's a portion of people like view them as a goofy '60s band, but I think everybody loves like Abbey Road or something from the Beatles.
I mean, earlier you mentioned that their discography is a little bit more cohesive in the fact that they broke up early on compared to the greater scheme of how bands have lived and lasted for decades now. Do you think that their condensed discography and catalog has something to do with their lasting impact, whereas they didn't have like an era of like putting out crappy albums?
Yeah, I think so because I think on top of the not putting out crappy albums factor like you mentioned, on top of that there's also the factor of like the what if scenario, where I feel like every year in the '70s I wasn't there for it, but I feel like
Same.
you always read stories of like every year in the '70s like, well, 1976 Paul and John were hanging out in the Dakota and they almost went and reunited the Beatles on SNL, and like,
Yeah.
or like John and Paul had a drug-fueled jam session with like Stevie Wonder and it wasn't Harry Nilsson. I can't remember who else was
Yeah.
there.
Nelson. Yeah. Stevie Wonder.
Yeah,
Nelson. Yeah.
and it was like that was the closest they came to record. Like on Ringo's album, all three Beatles contributed a song, so kind of like. And then like in the '90s, there was anthology with like the Threedles songs. Like I just feel like the mystique around a reunion was also kind of drove them to relevancy like throughout the decades after they broke up as well.
That's interesting. So the constant rumors of will they get back together kept them alive more so than an active band who was putting out new music.
Yeah, I think so. And like I think another big part, like you said, was they didn't have their chance to have like a flop album, in the '70s. Like I think some people in the Rolling Stones fan base kind of like regret some of their like later '70s and '80s work, and
Yeah.
and I think like the Beach Boys, they had like, which I mean, I can't speak from our perspective because like Love You is like one of my favorite records. But like I show my brother, not Gavin, but my younger brother who doesn't play music, Love You, and he's like, dude, I listened to the song Solar System and like, what was that? Like,
It's magic. That's what it is.
yeah, I know. So so it's like, I think they didn't have their chance to have an album that really wasn't commercial at all.
Yeah.
Like Paul didn't put out Temporary Secretary as a '70s Beatles record. I love that song by the way, but
Oh, me
like
too. It's
a lot of
great.
people don't.
I saw him do it live one time. It was awesome.
That's so cool.
Um, yeah, and that's an interesting point too. You mentioned the Stones and like, they kind of were, the bad boy version of the Beatles in the 60s, and they were definitely the neck and neck in terms of popularity at that time. But their body of work has been, they just put out an album a couple of years ago. Do you think if the Beatles had gotten back together, let's say John and George never passed away, and the Beatles got back together in like 2007 or something and put
Mm.
out an album, do you think it would have had some sort of global shift, like, oh my God, world peace happened because the Beatles got back together, or like, hunger is over? What do you think would have happened if the Beatles actually got back together?
They feed some mouths for their music.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I have the ideal way it would go in my head, I think, for me as a fan. But I think realistically, is it just a one-off reunion, like a one
Yeah,
record?
they did like one album and maybe a couple of shows.
Okay, I think what happens, I'm trying to compare, because I know I wasn't around for Anthology. I wasn't born yet when it came out,
Yeah,
but I have a friend who was around. He was a teenager at the time when it came out, and he was saying like, you know, like for that year after they put out the new songs and Anthology came out, or I think it was one per album, wasn't it?
yeah.
So I think yeah,
First,
when they
yeah,
like put Free as a Bird out, he said like you would hear that all over the radio, and you'd hear Beatles songs all over it, all over the radio in '95 or whatever
yeah.
year it was, '94 or whatever. And so like I think it would be one of those situations. I think it'd be like another anthology situation where you'd get a whole lot of you know whatever song they put out, Yellow Submarine Part Two on the radio everywhere, and then
We're still
yeah,
trapped in the Yellow Submarine. Yeah,
yeah, the Blue Submarine,
yeah. Those,
but but yeah, I think it'd just be kind of a similar impact that had, where it'd be, commercially you'd hear the new stuff everywhere, and then there'd be a resurgence of the back catalog kind of deal. Um, and then the reunion shows. I feel like I'm trying to think of like is it like a recent band? Didn't Pink Floyd get together like 2006 or something? Like they did like a reunion.
they got put together at Live 8 in 2005.
Oh, five.
Well,
Maybe it'd
four.
be something like that, like a
Yeah.
couple shows like of that magnitude, probably bigger, I'd assume.
Yeah.
Ideally, though, I think it'd be really cool. I think it would have been cool if they would have done like just a one-off show, kind of like that. Maybe put out
100%.
some new music, but I feel like I thought Now and Then was like pretty cool, but I don't think it's gonna. I think it was panned pretty hard because I don't think people were gonna. It sounds so far removed from everything, from the rest of the catalog.
I know. I like Now and Then, but like George isn't on it at all besides
Yeah,
archival audio from his voice. And
right.
they literally played that song for a half hour and he was like, nah, I'm good.
Yeah, no, he's like
That was it.
rapping it.
They did nothing to it.
He didn't want to go on the roof.
Yeah, let's go on the roof. So you've obviously thought about this band a lot. They've impacted your life tremendously. Like you've had this band for a number of years now where your music is definitely 60s and indie influenced, and they've been a big part of your life for a long time. How did you discover the Beatles, and what was the moment that you realized, like, wow, like this is my favorite band. Like this is the one that I want to like go back to.
So yeah, I don't even like remember discovering the Beatles just because my dad is also a really big Beatles freak. So I just since I was a baby, he would like put the White Album on. That was the main album we'd listen to when I was little. He'd put the White Album on, he'd rock me around the house. You know what I mean? And it was a long album, so I barely got there.
Nostalgia.
That's probably why I'm so weird because I probably like shaking me around. So but no, I mean I remember there's pictures of me like when I was like 2 or 3 with a tennis racket, watching like Hard Day's Night and Hell, and like playing the tennis racket along to those movies. And
Yeah.
so yeah, the Beatles are like I don't feel unique in saying this, but because there's millions of people like this, but I feel like the Beatles are just like another part of like my life. It's whereas the Beach Boys, I'm a huge fan. They're like my 1B, but like I didn't really fully get them till like high school. So
Yeah.
like the Beatles just they feel like more like the new thing that came along and I discovered and it saved me, whatever, that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
with the Beatles, it's just kind of like always just it's just part of my subconscious.
Well, to that effect, and as we're kind of slightly wrapping up a little bit here, what has changed in your fandom since you were a kid? Because when you were a kid, there was no internet like we know it. There was no social media. There was no sharing of content the way that we openly do now, so easily and so accepted. How do you think your fandom has shifted, and do you think you're more of a fan now than you were as a kid, or how has it changed?
Um, as well, I think it's changed in a way. Like when I was a kid, I was just a music enjoyer. Like I didn't really care about writing songs or learning how to write songs or anything like that until I was probably like 14 or 15. So getting back into the Beatles around that time and then learning like how they wrote their songs, and how I could rip them off. That kind of like opened my world because before it was like, oh, these guys are really cool and funny. I like their songs, they're catchy songs.
Yeah.
But then I'm like listen to Here, There, and Everywhere. I'm like, and it's just like, dude, like Paul McCartney wrote this, man. Like
How they do that?
yeah,
Yeah.
like what, like what in the world? So I think it gives you a whole new appreciation when you come at it from songwriting or like a music creator angle, as opposed to, like you think they're absolute gods or greats as a fan, but then like when you come to them as a fan, but also a music creator, you're like, like what's a step above God? Like that's what they are. Like, like,
The Beatles.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's this thing where it's like, I guess I have to answer your question, I have like a whole new appreciation for them in the last 10 years I've been writing music.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of which, like with your group, the Burkharts, do you have one song in particular that you feel is the most Beatly inspired?
Um, I think the last one we did, Always on the Run, I remember, I mean, I don't ever try to like go like too down like one path with like an influence on a song.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of them sound very Beach Boysy, but I always try to throw something else from other influences in there. Um, except for on the upcoming album, that there's one there where I was like, oh, "You guys want to hear a Beach Boys song? I got you." Like, but Always on the Run. I remember I was like, I really want the bass in this song to sound like Paperback Writer.
Yeah.
It's just real thumpy and kind of grooving around. So I really wanted Always on the Run to give like a Paperback Writer kind of rhythm section feel. And then a lot of my friends tell me that Pretty Words sounds really like McCartney-esque. Um,
I can see that.
yeah, I guess so. I mean, I was, I listen to all that stuff all the time. So anything that I steal from the Beatles and the Beach Boys, I think like it's kind of like a married thing where it's like Paul or Brian would do this, maybe a
I
lot
mean,
better than I could.
if
But
you're gonna steal, steal from the best.
that's
I would
right.
say.
That's right.
Last question for you, Trevor, from the Burkharts. If you could recommend only one Beatles album to an alien that's never heard the Beatles before, and you're like, you know what, this is the one, this is your gateway Beatles record, which is it?
Oh man. Oh, this is gonna be tough. Ooh. Okay. I would have to say, you know what? I'm gonna be controversial here. I'm gonna be controversial. I'm gonna tell them, listen to Please Please Me, and naturally you're just gonna want to listen to the rest. So just start at the beginning. Boom. Yeah.
Okay, that's smart. That's smart. Smooth,
Yeah.
man.
You get one from me, but on your own, you're gonna be like, all right, with the Beatles, Beatles for sale, you're gonna go down the list.
Just go down the Spotify
Or
list after that, you're set. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, Trevor, man, this was so much fun to chat about the Beatles and your spin on why you enjoy them and why you think they're important. Where can people find you if you want to promote yourself for a second?
Um, Listen to the music on Spotify. We are the Burkharts, my band. If you like the Beatles and the Beach Boys, you'll probably like us. We like to. We're very apparently influenced by them. So we're like, those guys light. So if you like them, you might like us. And then if you like the music, sometimes we post updates about ourselves personally on Instagram, the Burkharts music. And yeah, DM us if you ever want to talk about any music because I love talking about it.
There you go. Well, guys, thank you so much for watching the first episode of What's Your Spin? There's gonna be a little logo that shows up somewhere over here. And way more to come, way more cool chats to have. But Trevor, man, you're the first episode, so thanks for being here. This was
It's an
awesome.
honor. You're a great friend. It's been great doing these with you. Can't wait to do more.
We'll do more, man. Thanks, dude.